They called it the Superfortress, but to the Japanese pilots who first saw it, it looked more like a machine from another world. High above the Pacific, it appeared, shining, massive, untouchable. The B-29 wasn't just an airplane, it was a symbol of a nation that refused to slow down. Every time Japan thought it had destroyed one, 10 more appeared in the sky the next week. Factories across America thundered day and night, building these metal giants faster than Japan could even count. When Japanese pilots saw wave after wave of bombers filling the heavens, some whispered in disbelief. Are they making them faster than we can shoot them down? That question wasn't just fear, it was the moment Japan realized. This wasn't a battle of pilots anymore. It was a battle of industry, will, and time itself. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned into a struggle of endurance and production. Japan's pilots were brave, fearless even, but courage could not outbuild steel. Across the ocean, the United States had transformed into something the world had never seen before, an arsenal powered by millions of ordinary citizens working around the clock. In factories that never slept, men and women forged the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its time. It could fly higher, farther, and carry more destruction than anything Japan had ever faced. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible that a country could build so many of these giants, and yet, every week, new squadrons appeared as if from nowhere. The sky over Japan began to fill, not with clouds, but with silver wings. And behind every one of those wings stood a nation that had decided to win not by chance, but by sheer unstoppable production power. This is the story of the moment Japan realized. America wasn't just fighting with soldiers, it was fighting with factories. In the early years of World War II, American engineers faced an almost impossible challenge, to create a bomber that could reach Japan from distant bases, fly higher than enemy fighters, and carry enough firepower to cripple an empire. It sounded like a fantasy. Yet, out of that ambition and desperation, came the birth of the B-29 Superfortress. Before the B-29, the United States struggled to project power across the Pacific. The ocean was vast, and Japan's fortifications stretched deep into island chains. Conventional bombers like the B-17 simply didn't have the range. America needed something extraordinary, a machine that could bridge oceans and strike with precision. In 1940, engineers at Boeing began designing what would become the most advanced aircraft of the war. It featured a pressurized cabin so crews could fly higher than anti-aircraft guns could reach, remote-controlled machine gun turrets, and an enormous payload capacity that dwarfed anything Japan possessed. But building it was another story. The technology was new, the parts were experimental, and the cost was staggering, more than the entire Manhattan Project. Still, the urgency of war left no room for hesitation. Factories in Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington, were transformed into temples of innovation. Thousands of workers, men, women, even teenagers, trained to assemble the parts of an aircraft no one had ever flown before. The first prototypes took shape amid sleepless nights, blaring sirens, and the echo of machinery that symbolized America's industrial heartbeat. When the first B-29 rolled out for testing, it was not perfect. Engines overheated, systems failed, and several prototypes crashed. Yet the determination behind it was unstoppable. Boeing engineers refused to surrender, every disaster became a lesson. They redesigned, reinforced, and reimagined until the Superfortress could finally conquer the sky. By 1943, the B-29 had evolved from a dream into a flying fortress of precision and endurance. With its gleaming aluminum body and wings that stretched nearly 141 feet, it dominated the horizon like a mechanical titan. Pilots who first entered its cockpit spoke of awe and disbelief. The aircraft could climb to 31,000 feet, where Japanese fighters struggled to reach, and drop bombs with deadly accuracy from altitudes where clouds thinned into silver mist. For Japan, this was more than a technological leap, it was a glimpse of the nightmare ahead. Intelligence reports began to whisper about a new American bomber capable of reaching Tokyo itself. For an island nation that had once dominated the Pacific, the thought of enemy planes crossing such distances seemed unthinkable. Yet the unthinkable was becoming real. Every B-29 represented more than metal and engines, it was a testament to a nation united in purpose. From the Midwest to the Pacific coast, every factory, every worker, every hand that turned a wrench or tightened a bolt contributed to a single, terrifying reality, the birth of an air force that could reach anywhere, anytime. In the months that followed, the B-29 would not only become the spearhead of America's long-range bombing campaign, it would also redefine the meaning of industrial warfare. Japan's military commanders could prepare for battle, but how could they prepare for a machine that never stopped coming? The Superfortress was not just another aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's will to end the war, a promise forged in sweat, steel, and sacrifice. And as America's assembly lines grew louder, the skies over the Pacific began to darken with the shadow of what was coming next. The B-29 was ready. The question was Japan? By 1944, the United States had become something no nation had ever been before, a machine built to wage war. Every city, every town, and every factory had one purpose: to outproduce the enemy. The story of the B-29 wasn't just about engineering, it was about the relentless heartbeat of American industry, thundering day and night across the homeland. In places like Wichita, Seattle, and Marietta, vast aircraft plants stretched further than the eye could see, colossal cathedrals of metal and sweat. Here, tens of thousands of workers, many of whom had never touched a plane before the war, learned to assemble one of the most complex machines on Earth. The factories ran on 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. There was no silence, no stillness, only the endless roar of progress. Every rivet driven into the shining aluminum skin of a B-29 echoed with determination. Women, who once worked as teachers or homemakers, now wore overalls and welding masks. They stood shoulder to shoulder with men, tightening bolts, wiring instruments, and loading engines onto assembly lines that never stopped. The slogan, "We can do it," wasn't just a poster, it was a truth being lived every minute. At Boeing's Wichita plant alone, 1 B-29 was completed every single day. And that number kept rising. The factory floor looked like a city in motion, cranes moving giant fuselages, sparks flying as welders joined metal frames, foremen shouting over the thunder of machines. Coffee was poured endlessly, radios played patriotic music, and lunch breaks were short because time itself had become a weapon. The Japanese military couldn't comprehend what they were facing. Their pilots fought with unmatched bravery, but their factories, limited by bombings, shortages, and lack of raw materials, could not keep up. Japan built fewer than 1,000 heavy bombers in the entire war. America was building that many B-29s every few weeks. Intelligence reports from the Japanese army told stories of disbelief. Pilots who returned from missions over the Marianas Islands described the skies as flooded with bombers. "There were too many to count," one pilot said. "We would destroy one formation, and another would appear behind it." The sky had no end. What Japan didn't know was that behind every B-29 that soared over the Pacific, there were thousands of hands keeping it alive, machinists, engineers, factory mothers, and teenagers learning to rivet. Each bomber was the product of millions of hours of labor and an economy that had learned to turn ideas into weapons faster than the enemy could react. The power of American industry during World War II was something entirely new, it was a civilization mobilized. Trains carried engines from Michigan, propellers from California, and gun turrets from Connecticut, all converging in plants where every component found its match. Within weeks, raw aluminum and rubber transformed into the deadliest aircraft Japan had ever faced. And while American newspapers published victory headlines, the truth behind the triumph was written in sweat and exhaustion. Workers slept beside conveyor belts, ate meals beside machines, and spent holidays tightening bolts on bombers that would soon thunder across the Pacific. Each B-29 that rolled off the line was given a name: Enola Gay, Fiery Ginger, General H, Arnold Special, symbols of the pride that powered a nation. Some of those planes never made it home, but their creation was proof of something greater than destruction: unity. America had turned its factories into a single beating heart, pumping steel, oil, and resolve into every machine of war. When Japanese pilots first encountered entire squadrons of B-29s, they could not believe how fast new ones appeared. They thought perhaps the Americans had an endless stockpile stored somewhere. What they didn't realize was that America had found a way to make war mathematical, to multiply effort until the impossible became ordinary. For Japan, every B-29 shot down was a victory. But for the United States, every bomber lost was already replaced before it hit the ocean. This reality broke more than morale, it shattered the illusion of balance. In Tokyo, generals reviewed reconnaissance photos and shook their heads. The smoke rising over Japanese cities was not just from bombings, it was from the burning realization that they could never match the tempo of a nation that never stopped building. In the end, the sound that haunted Japanese skies wasn't just the thunder of engines, it was the echo of millions of hammers back in America, beating like war drums, building the machines that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The B-29 was no longer just a bomber. It was the voice of American industry, roaring across oceans, carrying not just bombs, but the undeniable truth, that the war had become a contest of endurance, and Japan was running out of time. When the first formations of B-29 Superfortresses appeared over the Pacific, the Japanese Air Force could hardly believe what they were seeing. At first, it was a few glimmers of silver high above the clouds, dots so distant they seemed like stars. Then came the deep, thunderous hum, a vibration that rolled across the sky, echoing through mountains, fields, and coastal towns. It wasn't one plane. It wasn't 10. It was hundreds. Japanese radar stations sent frantic reports. Squadrons scrambled, anti-aircraft guns turned skyward, and pilots rushed to intercept. But as they climbed, they discovered something terrifying: the B-29s were flying higher than their fighters could reach. The Mitsubishi Zero, once feared across the Pacific, struggled to climb above 30,000 feet. The B-29s flew beyond 31,000, where the air thinned, and the Japanese engines gasped for breath. For many pilots, it was their first true encounter with the industrial scale of American warfare. There were too many, one recalled. No matter how many we tried to fight, more came. The sky was filled with silver monsters. The Japanese command had expected small raids, perhaps reconnaissance or limited strikes. But the waves never stopped. 1 week, 50 bombers came. The next, there were 200. Then 300. Factories, refineries, and military bases across the Japanese mainland came under relentless bombardment. Each attack seemed larger, more organized, and more confident. In one operation, over 500 B-29s took off from the Marietta Islands, a fleet so massive that Japanese observers on the ground mistook it for an invasion. The sun glinted off their wings, turning the horizon into a river of light. Civilians stared upward in silence, unable to comprehend how a single nation could produce so many flying fortresses. For the Japanese pilots, each mission became a desperate struggle. They would climb as high as their engines allowed, push their planes to the limit, and dive into formations of B-29s bristling with machine guns. The air turned into a storm of tracer fire and shrapnel. Some pilots never returned. Others came back with their planes shredded by .50 caliber rounds, their eyes wide with disbelief. And still, the bombers came. Each formation carried thousands of pounds of bombs. Precision strikes at first, industrial complexes, shipyards, oil refineries. But as the war dragged on, the strategy changed. The Americans realized that Japan's military strength was tied not only to its factories but to the spirit of its people. So the bombings moved closer, to the heart of cities. Japanese citizens took shelter in tunnels and underground bunkers, listening to the rumble of engines far above. The sound became a symbol of dread, not because of what was coming, but because it never stopped coming. For the Japanese military leadership, the truth became impossible to ignore. Their pilots were skilled, their defenses courageous, but they were fighting an enemy that didn't seem to run out of anything, not men, not machines, not time. Every new day, reports arrived, more bombers over Kyushu. More over Nagoya. More over Tokyo. The psychological effect was devastating. Even the most loyal officers began to realize the scale of what they faced. Japan's production lines, already strained by shortages and bomb damage, couldn't replace planes or pilots fast enough. Each lost Zero was a loss Japan could feel. Each lost B-29 was replaced before dawn. In one diary recovered after the war, a Japanese pilot wrote, "When I looked at the sky, I saw not aircraft, but factories flying toward us." That sentence captured the truth perfectly. The war had evolved into something beyond bravery and tactics. It had become a war of production, one Japan could not win. As the bombings intensified, the Japanese sky itself became a symbol of futility. The endless hum of engines haunted cities day and night. Each wave of bombers was not just an attack, it was a reminder that America's might extended far beyond the battlefield. And as the fires of war began to consume Japan's cities, one truth echoed louder than the explosions themselves. No army could defeat an enemy that could build faster than you could bury your dead. By 1945, the sound of B-29 engines had become a grim lullaby over Japan. Every night, people looked to the sky, not for stars, but for shadows. The bombers came like clockwork, precise, unending, and merciless. What began as high-altitude raids on military targets had now evolved into a campaign of fire and fear, one that would leave Tokyo, the heart of Japan, in ashes. On the night of March 9, 1945, more than 300 B-29 Superfortresses roared toward the Japanese capital. Each carried clusters of incendiary bombs, small canisters filled with jellied gasoline designed not to explode, but to burn. The crews inside the bombers could already see the glow of the city long before they reached it. Tokyo, once a sea of lights, was now a target the size of the horizon itself. As the first wave dropped its load, the effect was instant and horrifying. The city ignited like dry tinder. Wooden houses and narrow streets turned into channels of flame. The fire moved faster than people could run. Within minutes, entire districts were erased in walls of orange and red. The roar of the inferno drowned out the engines above. From the sky, American pilots saw a spectacle unlike anything in human history, a city burning brighter than daylight, smoke spiraling 20,000 feet high. From the ground, it was pure apocalypse. People threw themselves into rivers to escape the heat, only to find the water boiling. Firefighters collapsed where they stood. Those who survived later said the wind itself caught fire. The Japanese military tried to respond, but there was no enemy to shoot down. The bombers were too high, too fast, too many. Anti-aircraft shells burst uselessly below the clouds, and the city continued to burn. By morning, more than 100,000 people were dead, and a quarter of Tokyo was gone. Yet even as Japan counted its dead, the B-29s were already returning to their bases, reloading, refueling, preparing for the next night. The message was clear: America's strength was not in revenge, but in repetition. It could do this every day if it chose to. Over the following months, other cities followed the same fate: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Each time the sky filled with hundreds of B-29s, Japan's anti-aircraft defenses fired desperately, but the waves kept coming. Smoke choked the air, flames painted the night. Civilians dug through rubble searching for loved ones, while factories that once produced aircraft and munitions now lay in twisted ruins. Even Japanese leaders, hardened by years of war, began to lose hope. Reports described the destruction as beyond comprehension. The emperor's advisors whispered what many already knew: Japan could not sustain another year. The empire that once dreamed of domination was now reduced to survival. And still, the bombers came. Each mission was another hammer strike on Japan's crumbling resolve. The B-29 had become more than a weapon, it was a symbol of inevitability. No matter how many cities burned, America's production lines continued, relentless, unstoppable. Every week, new bombers rolled out of factories. Every flight brought Japan closer to surrender. For those who watched from below, the sky itself had turned into an enemy, vast, mechanical, and merciless. And for the Japanese pilots who once ruled that sky, there was nothing left to fight but their own disbelief. The age of the warrior was ending. The age of the machine had begun. And above the ashes of Tokyo, the superfortress kept flying, cold, unstoppable, and utterly victorious. When the war finally neared its end, Japan lay silent beneath a sky that had once echoed with the roar of engines. The same B-29s that had once been symbols of fear now flew unchallenged, crossing over cities that no longer had the strength to resist. What began as a contest of soldiers had transformed into a battle of endurance, and in that battle, America had proven unstoppable. The B-29 Superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was the living embodiment of industrial might, of millions united by a single purpose. Each rivet, each bolt, each flight hour represented not just technology, but belief, the unshakable faith that victory could be built, piece by piece, on assembly lines across an ocean. For Japan, the sight of endless waves of bombers was more than a military defeat, it was a revelation. The war had shown them that courage alone could not compete with machinery, that honor could not replace production. A nation of warriors had been brought to its knees by a nation of workers. And when two B-29s, Enola Gay and Boxcar, delivered the final blows to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the message was complete. The era of hand-forged war was over. The future belonged to those who could outbuild, outthink, and outlast. In the quiet aftermath, American pilots looked down at the smoldering cities and understood that they had witnessed not just victory, but transformation. The B-29 had rewritten the rules of warfare. It proved that in the modern world, power was not measured by courage, but by capacity. And in that truth lay the most haunting lesson of all. The war was won not in the skies above Japan, but in the factories of America.